There's a moment, just a few seconds long, that changed the entire course of one of the most famous marriages in music history. Priscilla Presley stood in front of her husband, the king of rock and roll, and said 3 words that should have brought pure joy. I'm pregnant. And Elvis froze. Not a smile, not a hug, just silence. What happened in the seconds, days, and months that followed would quietly reshape their marriage forever, and it's a story fans still whisper about today. Stay until the end, because Chapter 5 reveals the part almost nobody talks about. When Priscilla Beaulieu first met Elvis Presley in Germany in 1959, she was just a teenager, and he was already the most famous man on the planet. Their courtship became the stuff of legend: secret phone calls, late-night visits to Graceland, and a romance the public devoured for years before they ever said "I do." By the time they finally married in Las Vegas in May 1967, Priscilla had spent nearly a decade shaping herself around Elvis's world. She learned to dress the way he liked, wear her hair the way he preferred, and structure her entire life around his career, his moods, and his unpredictable schedule. To outsiders, it looked like a fairy tale. From the inside, it was something far more complicated. A relationship built as much on devotion as it was on control. Still, in the earliest days of their marriage, there was genuine warmth between them. Elvis called Priscilla his little girl, and she, in turn, adored the version of him few fans ever saw, the quiet, vulnerable man behind the rhinestone jumpsuits and sold-out arenas. Friends close to the couple often described a tenderness in private that rarely made it into headlines. But even then, subtle warning signs were there. Elvis's career demanded constant travel, late-night recording sessions, and long stretches in Hollywood or Las Vegas. Priscilla, left behind at Graceland more often than not, quietly built a life of her own, one that didn't always revolve around waiting for him to call. Those absences bred a loneliness Priscilla rarely spoke about publicly. She filled her days with routines, friendships, and eventually quiet ambitions of her own. Small acts of independence that, whether Elvis realized it or not, were slowly shifting the balance of their relationship. By early 1968, less than a year into their marriage, something had changed. Priscilla wasn't the wide-eyed teenager who once waited by the phone. She had grown into a woman with her own instincts, her own needs, and soon, life-altering news that would test everything the two of them had built. What she didn't know yet was how Elvis would respond when she told him. And that reaction, more than the wedding, more than the fame, more than any headline, would end up defining the rest of their marriage. Priscilla later described the moment she realized she was pregnant as one filled with both excitement and quiet anxiety. She knew Elvis wanted a family. He'd spoken about it before, almost wistfully, as though fatherhood might anchor him in a way that fame never could. But she also knew Elvis. She knew how deeply his own image was tied to his sense of youth, energy, and control over how the world perceived him. A baby meant change. It meant Graceland would no longer just be the king's palace. It would become a family home, with all the noise, mess, and unpredictability that comes with it. According to accounts from those close to the couple, Priscilla chose her moment carefully. She wanted privacy, calm, and Elvis's full attention, something increasingly rare given his packed schedule of recording sessions and looming return to live performances after years focused on Hollywood films. When she finally told him, the room reportedly went still. Elvis didn't erupt in anger, and he didn't sweep her off her feet either. Instead, witnesses described something almost harder to read, a long pause, a searching look, as if he were trying to process not just the news, but everything it meant for his life, his image, and the marriage he had built with a woman he still, in many ways, saw as his little girl. For Priscilla, that silence spoke volumes. She had hoped for elation. What she got instead was a man visibly wrestling with the weight of what was coming. Some insiders close to the Presley circle have suggested Elvis's hesitation wasn't about not wanting the baby, but about fear. Fear of responsibility. Fear of losing the version of Priscilla he'd shaped over the better part of a decade. Fear, even, of his own capacity to be a present father, given a career that rarely allowed him to be present for anything else. Within moments, though, accounts suggest Elvis did pull Priscilla close, murmuring reassurances, telling her this was wonderful news. But something in that first frozen reaction stayed with her. A flicker of hesitation she would remember long after the initial shock faded. It was a small crack, nearly invisible at the time, but cracks, as Priscilla would come to learn, have a way of widening. Priscilla's pregnancy unfolded under intense scrutiny. Elvis Presley was, at that point, arguably the most photographed man in America, and any development in his personal life became instant headline material. Fans and tabloids alike speculated wildly about the pregnancy, the state of the marriage, and what fatherhood might do to Elvis's carefully managed public image. Behind Graceland's gates, the reality was more complicated than any magazine cover could capture. Elvis, ever protective of Priscilla, tried to shield her from the media frenzy, but the pressure of the outside world inevitably seeped into their private life. Friends and staff at Graceland later recalled a noticeable shift in the household's rhythm. Elvis, who had always been deeply attached to routine and control, found himself adjusting to a wife who was, both literally and figuratively, no longer entirely his in the way she once was. Priscilla's attention, energy, and identity were expanding to include someone else entirely, their unborn child. There were tender moments, too. Elvis reportedly grew fascinated with the pregnancy in his own way, sometimes placing his hand on Priscilla's stomach late at night, talking to the baby, imagining what fatherhood might look like. Those close to him say it revealed a softer, more introspective side rarely seen by the public. But old patterns didn't disappear. Elvis's grueling schedule, soundtrack recordings, film obligations, and the earliest planning stages of what would eventually become his legendary '68 comeback special kept pulling him away from home for extended stretches. Priscilla, increasingly isolated as her due date approached, leaned more heavily on friends and Graceland's staff for companionship. It was during this period that the earliest seeds of emotional distance began to take root, not through dramatic conflict, but through the slow accumulation of missed moments, unspoken frustrations, and two people quietly growing in different directions while the world watched only the glamorous surface. By the time Priscilla's pregnancy reached its final weeks, she had changed. She was no longer simply Elvis's devoted young wife. She was becoming her own person, preparing to be a mother, and beginning, in small but unmistakable ways, to imagine a version of her life that didn't revolve entirely around him. On February 1st, 1968, Lisa Marie Presley was born. And for a brief, shining period, it seemed as though the baby might be exactly what the Presley marriage needed. Elvis, by most accounts, was besotted. He doted on his newborn daughter, reportedly spending hours simply watching her sleep, delighted by every small milestone. For a man whose life had long been defined by performance and image, fatherhood offered something rare, an experience that was entirely, unquestionably real. But even amid the joy, old patterns resurfaced quickly. Within weeks of Lisa Marie's birth, Elvis was back in the recording studio and preparing for what would become one of the most important professional comebacks of his career. The demands of Hollywood, television, and eventually live performance pulled him away from Graceland for increasingly long stretches, precisely the time when Priscilla needed a partner most. Priscilla, now a new mother navigating postpartum life largely on her own, found herself once again facing long, quiet nights at Graceland while Elvis chased the next stage of his career. The isolation she'd felt during pregnancy didn't disappear with the baby's arrival. If anything, it deepened, compounded by exhaustion and the enormous responsibility of raising a child mostly alone. It was during this period, according to several biographers and people close to the couple, that the emotional foundation of their marriage began to erode in earnest. Priscilla started to reevaluate not just her relationship with Elvis, but her own identity, who she was outside of being Mrs. Presley, a role she'd been groomed for since she was a teenager. Elvis, for his part, seemed unaware of just how far the distance had grown. Consumed by career pressures and the pursuit of reinventing his public image, he often assumed that as long as Priscilla and Lisa Marie were safe, comfortable, and provided for at Graceland, the marriage itself remained solid. It wasn't. And within a few short years, the quiet cracks that had started the night Priscilla first told him she was pregnant would grow into something neither of them could ignore. Looking back, many who study the Presleys' relationship point to that very first moment, Elvis's frozen reaction to Priscilla's pregnancy announcement, as an early, quiet preview of the emotional pattern that would define their marriage. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a fight. It was something subtler and, in many ways, more telling. A man who struggled to fully show up emotionally at pivotal moments, even when he loved deeply and meant well. Priscilla herself, in later interviews and her memoir, reflected on how Elvis's personality contained both extraordinary tenderness and profound emotional guardedness, a contradiction shaped by his own upbringing, sudden fame, and the immense pressure of being Elvis Presley to millions of people every single day. That first frozen reaction to her pregnancy announcement, many believe, wasn't really about the baby at all. It was about Elvis's lifelong struggle to fully surrender control of his image, his emotions, his future, even to the people he loved most. By 1972, just 4 years after Lisa Marie's birth, Priscilla made the decision to leave Graceland, ultimately filing for divorce in 1973. The marriage that had once captivated the world quietly ended, not with one explosive betrayal, but with years of accumulated distance that could, perhaps, be traced back to that very first frozen silence. And yet, despite the divorce, Elvis and Priscilla remained close for the rest of his life, bonded forever by Lisa Marie, by history, and by a love that, however complicated, never fully disappeared. That single reaction, that pause before he pulled her close, has become, for many fans, a symbol of everything both magical and heartbreaking about their relationship. Two people who loved deeply, but who were never quite able to meet each other fully in the moments that mattered most. In the end, Elvis and Priscilla's story reminds us that even the most legendary love stories are built by imperfect people, doing their best in an impossible spotlight. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. What do you think was really going through Elvis's mind in that frozen moment? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more untold stories from music's most iconic couples.